Are you ready for a story that will stir your emotions and keep you on the edge of your seat? Picture this. A decorated ex-soldier bound to a wheelchair rolls into a courtroom determined to say goodbye to his beloved horse. But in a moment that stunned everyone, the horse stepped forward and changed the outcome in ways no one could have predicted. If you want to experience every twist and heartfelt moment that follows, stay with us from start to finish. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our inspiring stories. Let's dive in. Under the stark glare of fluorescent lights, the high-ceilinged courtroom felt as suffocating as a battlefield bunker. Every seat was taken by curious onlookers and stern-faced officials, all transfixed by the unusual sight before them. In the center of the polished wooden floor sat Oliver Hayes, a decorated former officer who had served 2 tours overseas before a roadside explosion left him in a wheelchair. Next to him, towering in quiet elegance, was Champion, a spirited quarter horse with a gleaming bay coat and soft, intelligent eyes. The horse's tail flicked nervously, and his large hooves struck the floor with a muted clunk, as though he sensed that something of dire importance was unfolding. Despite the adrenaline coursing through Oliver's veins, he rested a reassuring hand on Champion's flank, silently reminding the animal and himself that they would face this together. The courtroom hush was profound. Even the journalists, known for their relentless prattle, held their tongues. Everyone present had come for a spectacle, but the weight of sorrow and longing in Oliver's expression gave them something else, a shared sense of empathy. He wore his old service uniform jacket over civilian slacks, an odd mixture of past and present, symbolizing the limbo in which he now lived. That uniform once represented his pride, his honor, and his ability to stand on his own 2 feet. Now it served as a gentle reminder of how suddenly life could shift. Seated beside Oliver was his attorney, Ms. Rollins, a poised woman in her early 40s who had been deeply moved by Oliver's plight. She had taken on the case pro bono, stating more than once that men like him deserved more from the nation they had risked everything to defend. On the opposing side sat a dour-faced government lawyer named Mr. Prentice, who flipped through his files with unwavering concentration. Prentice's arguments came down to bureaucratic red tape and the notion that Champion was government property. That cold phrase seemed to sap the oxygen from the room whenever it was repeated, a stark contrast to Oliver's heartfelt conviction that this horse was a comrade, not a commodity. High above them, Judge Barrow, a gaunt man with sharp cheekbones, observed everything with an inscrutable gaze. He was known for applying the letter of the law with fierce rigor, yet something about his expression suggested a crack in his stern judicial veneer. Perhaps it was the memory of his own father, who had fought in an earlier conflict, or maybe it was simply human decency. Whatever the reason, the judge's eyes lingered on Champion a second longer than anyone expected. Oliver's lips pressed into a thin line as he watched Ms. Rollins finish her opening statements. The hush in the courtroom intensified when the judge finally asked, "Mr. Hayes, would you care to speak?" At that, Oliver felt the blood pound in his ears. This was his last chance, his final appeal to keep Champion by his side. And so, summoning all the courage once reserved for storming enemy lines, Oliver gripped the arms of his wheelchair and prepared to tell the story of how one horse had saved his life, both on foreign soil and on his darkest days back home. Oliver took a steadying breath before letting his voice fill the still air of the courtroom. He began by recounting the bleak desert roads of Afghanistan, where he and Champion had formed their bond under circumstances too harrowing for most civilians to grasp. He painted a picture of dawn patrols and swirling dust, the sharp crack of distant gunfire, and the ever-present fear that the road ahead might be laced with hidden explosives. In those tense early days, Champion had been designated as a specialized reconnaissance horse, part of a trial program to utilize the animals for patrolling terrain that even vehicles struggled to navigate. From the start, he displayed a keen awareness and an almost uncanny knack for sensing danger, saving both Oliver and his men from threats they couldn't see. He recalled a particular mission, one that turned his life upside down. Their convoy was struck by a roadside bomb, the concussive force throwing Oliver from his seat and leaving his unit in disarray. Through the haze of pain, he saw Champion pinned under a twisted section of metal siding, letting out panicked whinnies as bullets ricocheted off nearby rocks. Oliver crawled toward the horse, ignoring the searing pain in his own legs, determined to free the one living being he felt responsible for in that moment. When he managed to cut Champion loose, the animal unexpectedly turned and nudged Oliver with his muzzle, as if urging him to stand or at least hold on. Then, with a strength Oliver had never before witnessed, the horse dragged him behind a natural rock formation, providing shelter from the hail of gunfire until reinforcements arrived. Oliver's voice trembled as he described that day. His wheelchair, the result of that mission gone wrong, was proof of how close he had come to losing his life. If Champion hadn't been there, Oliver said, addressing the judge directly, I wouldn't be here to speak before you. He sensed the ambush before any of us did. And even after I was hurt, he refused to leave me. That's not just an animal's instinct. That's loyalty. That's partnership. Across the aisle, Mr. Prentice shifted uncomfortably, and a tinge of unease flickered in his eyes. Perhaps he realized that legal jargon about military assets paled in comparison to the raw human and equine connection Oliver was describing. Judge Barrow clasped his hands, his eyes focusing not on Oliver, but on the horse standing quietly beside him. Champion's ears flicked back and forth, as though keenly attuned to the gravity of Oliver's testimony. A palpable tension cloaked the spectators, many of whom dabbed at tear-filled eyes. Oliver swallowed hard, summoning the final portion of his testimony. When I lost my mobility, he said softly, it felt like I lost my purpose. But every day I'd go out to Champion's stable, and he'd be waiting for me, waiting for us to do our exercises, or for me just to brush his coat. It didn't matter that I couldn't walk. He never judged me for it. Instead, he gave me a reason to keep living, one small step at a time. The hush that settled after Oliver's words was deep and contemplative, like the still air before a thunderstorm. Judge Barrow tented his fingers beneath his chin, his mouth forming a tight line that betrayed his inner conflict. On the one hand, the law was explicit. Any horse assigned to a special operations unit was cataloged as government property, subject to strict regulations. On the other, the story of Oliver and Champion tugged relentlessly at the cords of empathy that none of the legal statutes could address. For a few moments, it seemed as though the judge was wrestling with two opposing forces, the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. In the row directly behind Oliver, a few veterans who'd come to show their support sat with solemn expressions. One of them was missing an arm. Another wore a prosthetic leg. They knew the cost of war more intimately than most, and their presence gave Oliver a quiet fortitude. He could sense their solidarity, even if they never said a word. Sitting among them was Noah Caldwell, an old friend who had served with Oliver. Noah's broad shoulders and steeled gaze reflected the battles he had survived, but more telling was the softness that emerged whenever Champion was around. Though he did not speak in court that day, Noah's eyes spoke volumes, silently affirming every word Oliver said about the depth of a soldier's bond with a horse that had shared the battlefield. Eventually, Mr. Prentice rose to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket as though arming himself for confrontation. He cleared his throat and launched into a litany of regulations and procurement records, detailing line after line of policy that outlined why Champion belonged to the government. With all due respect, he said, his tone polished but distant, the horse in question was acquired with taxpayer funds, trained by military personnel, and utilized in official capacity. Emotional ties, while understandable, cannot override federal mandates. Oliver's shoulders stiffened, but Ms. Rollins placed a calming hand on his forearm. She rose to respond, stating calmly that the unique circumstances of Oliver's disability and the extraordinary actions taken by Champion warranted an exception. She cited precedents of military dogs being awarded special dispensation to remain with their handlers, an argument that seemed to catch Mr. Prentice off guard. Though the attorney tried to hide it, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. It was clear that Miss Rollins was not only well-prepared, but deeply committed to winning. Champion remained unnervingly still through all of this, a testament to the extensive training he had received. Yet there was something in the horse's gentle eyes, an alertness that seemed almost human. Observers found it difficult not to project their own interpretations onto the animal's posture. Loyalty, fear, or perhaps quiet confidence that this soldier he stood beside would not fail him. The entire scene had taken on a near mythic aura, a battle between compassion and protocol that felt much larger than the walls surrounding them. After an hour of meticulous arguments and counter-arguments, Judge Barrow announced that he needed more time to review the evidence and the emotional testimonies. He scheduled a new hearing for the following day. At the sound of his gavel echoing through the chamber, a collective exhale rippled across the spectators. The tension in the room broke, giving way to murmurs and hushed conversations. Some people stood up, collecting coats and briefcases, while others seemed too dazed by what they'd witnessed to move. As Oliver wheeled himself away from the defendant's table, Champion obediently followed, his hooves clopping gently on the floor. A throng of reporters rushed forward, microphones and cameras poised to capture every second of the ex-officer's exit. Questions piled on top of one another in a noisy jumble. Mr. Hayes, how confident are you in tomorrow's ruling? Do you believe the government is out of line? Is Champion essential to your recovery? Oliver, exhausted and emotionally spent, merely bowed his head. Ms. Rollins and Noah Caldwell stepped in to shield him from the barrage, steering both man and horse toward the corridor that led outside. Once they reached the open air, Oliver could feel the crisp sunlight against his face, a small reprieve after the suffocating tension of the courtroom. He gave Champion a comforting pat on the neck, muttering quietly, "You did good in there, buddy." Noah helped Oliver guide Champion into a specially modified trailer. The horse stepped inside without resistance, as though sensing it was time to head back to more familiar ground. Ms. Rollins walked close behind, her briefcase tucked under one arm, a mixture of empathy and determination etched into her features. Before she parted ways, she squeezed Oliver's shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said softly, her eyes flicking to Champion. "Your story is more powerful than any regulation they can throw at us." The drive back to Stillwater Ranch was both somber and hopeful. On one hand, Oliver felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a heavy rucksack. It was possible that, by this time tomorrow, Champion would be stripped from his life forever. On the other, he couldn't ignore the glimmers of empathy he'd seen on Judge Barrow's face, nor the effect his testimony had on many in the courtroom. He took solace in the possibility that the law could accommodate mercy, or at least that it should. Pulling into the long gravel driveway, Oliver felt a knot in his chest loosen at the sight of open fields and the rustic wooden barn that had become Champion's sanctuary. The ranch was more than a piece of property. It was a symbol of freedom, a stretch of land where Oliver and Champion could heal together, far from the horrors of combat. As Noah parked the truck, Oliver stared at the horizon, a silent prayer forming in his mind. Let tomorrow bring justice. It was the only thought that could quell the dread creeping into his veins. Nightfall at Stillwater Ranch brought a chill that was both literal and metaphorical. The sky melted into a deep indigo, and a few early stars flickered above the rolling pasture. Normally, Oliver found the nights peaceful here, a soothing balm to the day's anxieties. But this evening, his mind spun with possibilities of what the morning might hold. Was it naive to hope the judge would see past the bureaucracy? Could he truly keep Champion by his side? Or would the government's claim on the horse prove insurmountable? Champion was settled in his stall, munching on fresh hay. Oliver brushed the horse's coat in slow, deliberate strokes, taking comfort in the rhythmic routine. As the bristles swept over Champion's back, he recalled the first time he'd groomed the horse after returning stateside. Back then, each brushstroke felt like a step toward reclaiming a piece of himself lost in the desert. Even now, with the stable's faintly sweet smell of straw and the gentle rustle of animals in the background, Oliver could almost forget the severity of the court proceedings. Almost. Noah was staying over that night, unwilling to leave Oliver to his own devices. The older soldier understood that the psychological toll of the hearing was just as draining as any physical limitation. Together, after ensuring Champion was settled, they made their way to the cozy living room of Oliver's ranch house, where a few framed medals and photographs told truncated tales of Oliver's service. The two men sat in silence for a while, each nursing a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Eventually, Noah broke the silence. "You think the judge will really consider all that was said today?" he asked, his gaze drifting to a photo on the wall, a younger Oliver standing next to a proudly uniformed group of soldiers. Oliver sighed, rolling his shoulders to relieve the tension. "I want to believe he will, but we both know how the system works. Sometimes it's more about regulations than what's right." They spoke in hushed tones about the possibility that Oliver might have to relinquish Champion. The conversation meandered, touching on the nightmares they both carried home from war, the sense of purpose animals could offer to wounded veterans, and the unshakable guilt that came from surviving when others did not. In sharing these fears and hopes, they found small comfort. When Noah finally retreated to the guest room and Oliver was left alone, he found his thoughts returning to Champion. In the dim lamplight, he retrieved an old journal from a rickety bookshelf near the couch. Flipping through pages filled with scrawled notes about desert missions, he paused at a hastily drawn sketch of Champion's head, done on a day when a young private had shown him how to doodle for stress relief. The horse's eyes in that sketch seemed every bit as soulful as the real thing. Closing the journal, Oliver let out a tired breath. Tomorrow he would learn if the hardest part of their journey was behind them, or just beginning. The next morning, dawn light crept over the ranch, painting the fields in gentle shades of gold and rust. Despite the beauty of the sunrise, an uneasy tension coursed through Oliver's veins. He dressed in the same combination of his old military jacket and civilian attire, slipping the jacket on with a reverence that bordered on ritual. As he maneuvered his wheelchair outside, he found Champion near the fence, ears perked and nostrils flaring as though greeting him with cautious optimism. Oliver offered the horse a sugar cube, which Champion accepted with a soft snort. The ride into town was almost identical to the day before, except that the sense of dread had burrowed deeper. Noah drove in silence, and Ms. Rollins followed in her own car, both vehicles heading for the courthouse that loomed like a fortress of decisions. Reporters were already crowding the steps, broadcasting their speculation live. A couple of them attempted to push microphones into Oliver's face, but Ms. Rollins expertly blocked their approach. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of a wounded veteran and his horse, a symbol of something far more complex than any headline could encapsulate. Inside, the courtroom was just as packed. Word of Oliver's story had spread, drawing an even larger crowd than before. Judge Barrow entered promptly, robes flowing around his thin frame, and a hush descended like a velvet curtain. The judge wasted no time, resting his folded hands on the bench as he began to speak. "I've considered the arguments presented," the judge announced, his gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on Oliver and Champion. "This court recognizes the government's official stance on property rights, but also acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances that have been made clear." Oliver gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his breath caught in his throat. Even Noah, who seldom displayed emotion, leaned forward with an intensity that spoke volumes. Miss Rollins kept her composure, but her eyes flicked reassuringly to Oliver, silently urging him to hope for the best. Judge Barrow continued, "It is this court's finding that Champion indeed served a specialized function within a military context. However, we cannot ignore the direct, life-saving actions and the therapeutic role he has played for Mr. Hayes, which transcends standard definitions of property. Effective immediately, Champion shall remain with Mr. Hayes under the condition that he not be sold, exploited for profit, or transferred to any third party." In the few seconds that followed, a collective whisper of relief fluttered across the room. Oliver felt a rush of warmth flood his chest, and he had to remind himself to breathe. It wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about validating the bond that had held him and Champion together when everything else had fallen apart. Yet as soon as the judge's gavel pounded and the legal victory became real, Oliver's inner caution reminded him that not all battles end simply because a verdict is rendered. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt a flicker of apprehension, an intuitive sense that someone somewhere might still seek to tear them apart. The courthouse erupted into a flurry of activity, with reporters and spectators alike jostling for space. Applause broke out among the veterans who had gathered to lend Oliver their silent support, and even Ms. Rollins allowed herself a rare smile. Amid the commotion, Champion let out a soft nicker, as if sharing in Oliver's moment of triumph. Oliver offered Ms. Rollins his heartfelt thanks, his voice laced with emotion he didn't bother to conceal. Overcome by the whirlwind of congratulations, he almost missed the persistent ring of his phone. When he finally answered, the gruff voice of a woman at the front desk of Stillwater Ranch crackled over the line. "Mr. Hayes, there's a man here looking for you. Says it's urgent." Frowning, Oliver glanced at Noah, who was keenly observing him. The ex-officer quickly wheeled himself out to a quieter spot in the hallway. Did he give a name? He asked. No, came the reply. He's in a black SUV, claims to be from some branch of the government. I told him you weren't home, but he left a message saying this wasn't over. The moment the call ended, Oliver felt a chill crawl up his spine, turning the bright flush of victory into a creeping sense of unease. It seemed almost too coincidental. They had just won the right to keep champion, only for some stranger to appear at his doorstep with a cryptic warning. He thought about the unyielding stance of the military administration, which had never wanted to relinquish champion. Could it be that certain officials were unwilling to accept the judge's decision? A wave of reporters closed in, oblivious to Oliver's sudden shift in mood. He forced a polite nod and a few words of gratitude, but the joy that had blossomed just moments earlier felt shadowed by the threat that had surfaced. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, Ms. Rollins noted the tension etched into his features. Oliver, are you all right? For a moment, he hesitated to reveal the phone call. Then he realized Miss Rollins needed to know. She'd been fighting his legal battles, but this next fight might be something more insidious. Somebody showed up at my ranch, he said quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid the prying ears of reporters. They said it wasn't over. Her eyes narrowed. We expected they might appeal, but this sounds like more than a simple legal action. Noah, overhearing the exchange, clenched his fists. We'll handle it, he assured Oliver, his voice gruff but protective. We've come too far to let some intimidation tactic tear you and Champion apart. As they carefully maneuvered Champion into the trailer again, Oliver's gaze drifted over the crowd of onlookers, and he couldn't help but wonder, who among them still saw the horse as nothing more than a piece of government hardware? That unspoken question lingered in his mind all the way home, overshadowing a victory that, under different circumstances, might have felt complete. 2 days had passed since the triumphant verdict, yet Stillwater Ranch felt anything but victorious. Oliver Hayes found himself watching the driveway more than usual, peering through half-closed blinds at the gravel road that stretched beyond a pair of weathered fence posts. On the day he returned from the courthouse, he had barely wheeled himself out of Noah Caldwell's truck when his ranch manager handed him a scribbled note. The message was terse. This isn't over. And it triggered a deep sense of unease that Oliver couldn't shake. That uneasy feeling intensified when neighbors reported seeing a black SUV idling near the property line late into the night, its occupants obscured by heavily tinted windows. Though Ms. Rollins had reassured him that legal recourse would protect Champion, Oliver's intuition warned him otherwise. The ex-officer in him, the one who had served multiple tours in perilous environments, recognized the subtle signs of being watched and tested. Even Champion, typically relaxed in the ranch's open pastures, began showing signs of nervousness, twitching his ears more often and pacing along the fence line. The horse's behavior hinted that the tension wasn't just in Oliver's mind. Champion sensed it too. In an attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Oliver rose earlier than usual each morning, rolling out to the stable to check on the horse before the sun fully broke the horizon. Grooming Champion's coat, feeling the muscular slope of his neck, and hearing the soft snorts of contentment usually settled Oliver's nerves. But these past few days, he found himself scanning the nearby tree line, half expecting to see a camera lens or a stranger's silhouette. When no one appeared, he struggled to decide if that was reassuring or an ominous calm before a brewing storm. He confided his concerns to Noah, who took them seriously. A fellow veteran who had experienced his share of unexpected threats, Noah suggested they establish a more secure perimeter around the property. They discussed installing motion-detecting floodlights, placing cameras near the entrance, and even reinforcing the gates. Though Oliver despised the idea of turning his peaceful ranch into a fortress, he couldn't ignore the cold spike of fear that shot through him whenever he remembered the note. Beyond the ranch's boundaries, the world moved on. News outlets had turned Oliver and Champion's story into a media sensation. Some hailed him as a hero who fought the system, while others questioned whether the court's leniency could lead to precedent-setting conflicts with the military. Online forums buzzed with heated debates, and a handful of extremist voices claimed that the horse remained the rightful property of the government, no matter how sympathetic Oliver's case appeared. It was this undercurrent of hostility that gnawed at Oliver's peace of mind. Despite Ms. Rollins's confidence, Oliver couldn't brush away the feeling that the legal victory had painted a target on his back. He realized that old rules of engagement applied here as well. Vigilance was key, complacency was a liability, and underestimating the opposition, whoever they were, could be a fatal mistake. With every passing hour, he became more convinced that Champion's safety hung in a precarious balance, and that he needed to prepare for whatever came next. Late in the afternoon of the third day, Oliver was returning from town with a trunk full of hardware supplies, motion sensors, additional locks, and a new chain for the main gate. The sun angled low in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the pasture. Something felt off the moment he pulled into the gravel driveway. A tension seemed to radiate from the wooden barn where Champion's stall was located. The ranch manager, a wiry man named Carl, jogged up to Oliver's truck, anxiety etched into every line of his face. Carl's voice quivered slightly as he explained that he'd spotted a tall figure lurking near the fence. By the time Carl approached, the figure had fled into the nearby woods, leaving only footprints in the freshly turned soil. "I tried to get a closer look," Carl said, removing his cap and twisting it nervously in his hands. "But they were gone before I could catch up. Might have had a vehicle waiting on the other side. I heard an engine rev and vanish." Oliver's heart sank. The phone calls, the note, and now a confirmed trespasser. This was no longer a vague threat. It was a direct invasion of his private space. "Did Champion seem spooked?" Oliver asked, pressing a palm against the stable's side door, as if reassuring himself the building was still secure. Carl nodded. "He's been pacing in his stall, ears pinned back. I don't like it, Oliver. Something about this doesn't feel like a random drifter or a neighborhood prank." Staring into the stable's dimly lit interior, Oliver could see the shape of Champion moving restlessly. He thought back to the times they'd faced ambushes on dusty roads, where every second counted, and instincts were the difference between survival and tragedy. This intrusion on his land, though less overtly violent, triggered the same primal sense of urgency. Without hesitation, Oliver contacted Ms. Rollins, relaying the incident in tense, clipped sentences. She listened patiently, her tone measured, though he detected concern in her voice. "We can report this to local law enforcement," she offered, "and I can file a motion for a protective order." Oliver appreciated her thoroughness, but a part of him questioned how effective a protective order would be against anonymous stalkers or anyone potentially acting under clandestine directives. He remembered how quickly the opposition had mobilized in court and realized they might operate just as swiftly outside it. Though he agreed to proceed with official channels, he knew he had to take matters into his own hands as well. After hanging up with Ms. Rollins, he scrolled through his phone contacts until he landed on the name of Wes Carter, another old friend from his unit. Wes had left the service a few months after Oliver, taking a security job in the private sector. If anyone knew how to set up a proper surveillance system or provide additional muscle, it would be Wes. Oliver shot him a brief message. "Need help at Stillwater Ranch. Threat unknown. Please come ASAP." He felt a surge of relief upon seeing the text bubble that indicated Wes was typing a reply almost immediately. Wes Carter arrived by noon the next day, driving a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had seen its share of rough roads. He stepped out onto Oliver's gravel driveway, an imposing figure with a military bearing that was hard to miss. His time in Special Forces had honed both his reflexes and his mindset, making him the ideal ally in uncertain situations. As soon as he greeted Oliver with a firm handshake, his gaze swept across the property, taking in every detail as if he were mentally mapping out a strategy. "I hear you've got uninvited guests," Wes said flatly, nodding at the ranch's perimeter where Carl had spotted the intruder. "Mind giving me the tour and pointing out where you want extra security?" Oliver led him around the ranch, explaining that so far the threats had been subtle. Notes, phone calls, and someone lurking by the fence. Champion, who typically met strangers with a curious stare, seemed uneasy with Wes at first, possibly sensing the tension thrumming through the air. But after a few gentle pats, the horse relaxed enough to lower his head in greeting. They spent the afternoon installing a series of high-resolution cameras in strategic spots, one overlooking the main gate, another near the barn's entrance, and a couple spaced out along the fence line where the intruder had been seen. Wes, who had a knack for simplifying complex tasks, showed Carl how to monitor the camera feeds from a dedicated tablet. He also installed motion sensor lights that would flood the property with bright illumination at the slightest detection of movement. Throughout the installation, Oliver felt conflicting emotions. On the one hand, these measures were vital for protecting Champion and the ranch. On the other, each security addition was a sobering reminder that he was no longer at peace, that the place meant to help him heal had become a potential battleground. He recalled a conversation he had had with Miss Rollins, who once told him, "A home should be a refuge." Right now, it felt more like a stage set for a confrontation. By the time dusk approached, they had secured the ranch well enough that Oliver experienced a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe with Wes around and the new systems in place, the shadowy threats would back off. Yet a nagging voice in the back of his mind refused to let him fully relax. Opponents who resorted to intimidation often escalated when confronted. If they were truly determined to seize Champion, they wouldn't be deterred by a few cameras and brighter lights. Taking a break in the barn, Oliver handed Wes a bottle of cold water. "Thanks for doing this," he said, nodding at the rows of camera feeds displayed on the tablet. Wes accepted the drink with a thoughtful shrug. "No thanks needed. We look out for our own," he replied. His gaze lingered on Champion, who was standing quietly in his stall, eyes wide and alert. Let's hope that seeing they can't sneak around anymore convinces them to give up, but be prepared for the opposite. Oliver nodded grimly, stroking Champion's muzzle. He knew firsthand that corners of the military could be as relentless as the deserts he once patrolled. Letting his guard down was not an option. That same evening, with security measures freshly in place, Oliver and Wes decided to take shifts monitoring the camera feeds. While Wes volunteered for the first watch, Oliver wheeled himself to his small study, where a battered desk held thick files of paperwork. At the top of the pile lay the official court documents confirming that Champion was to remain in Oliver's care. Glancing through them, he felt a stab of frustration. Legal victories were supposed to bring closure, but all he'd found was a new wave of conflict. Needing a break from the paperwork, Oliver turned his attention to the personal items scattered around the room. Photographs from his deployment, letters from fellow soldiers, and an old journal he had filled with sketches and memories of Champion. One entry in particular caught his eye, a passage describing the day Champion guided him out of an ambush, risking the horse's own safety to drag him behind a crumbling wall. The memory was simultaneously heartwarming and harrowing. "He's more than property, he's my reason to keep going," he had written. Outside, nightfall deepened, and a crisp wind rustled the leaves. Every so often, Oliver heard the faint sound of Wes's footsteps on the porch, a comforting reminder that he wasn't alone. The tension that had haunted his nights since the ominous note arrived was still present, but it was tempered by the knowledge that a trained friend had his back. Sometime near midnight, Wes's low voice crackled through the walkie-talkie they had set up. "Oliver, you copy?" Oliver grabbed the device, his pulse immediately ratcheting up. "Go ahead," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "Camera on the north fence is picking up motion. Looks like a figure, possibly two, skirting along the tree line. Hard to tell through the branches, but it doesn't look like an animal." Instantly, Oliver's instincts kicked in. He reached for the small handgun he kept locked in a drawer by his desk. Though he prayed they wouldn't need to use firearms, he believed in being prepared. "I'll meet you outside," he said, rolling out of the study with swift determination. They converged at the porch, scanning the live feed on the tablet's screen. A blurred silhouette occasionally flickered into view near the far fence, as though deliberately avoiding the well-lit areas. Wes lifted a pair of night vision binoculars to his eyes, muttering a soft curse. "They're checking for blind spots, smart enough to stay in the darker pockets. I see one figure, possibly a second behind him." Oliver's heart pounded. The cameras had only been installed that afternoon, and already someone was testing their defenses. This was no idle prowler, it was a deliberate probe. "We can't let them think we're pushovers," he said, voice firm. Wes nodded in agreement, switching off the porch light to better preserve their night vision. The two men silently headed toward the barn, determined to confront whoever was trespassing. In that moment, Oliver was reminded of everything he had fought for, both overseas and in the courtroom. He refused to let fear or intimidation reclaim any part of his life. Stepping off the porch felt like stepping into another world. The property that had once offered pastoral serenity was now cloaked in the same high-alert atmosphere Oliver remembered from military missions. Wes moved ahead with silent efficiency, his footing sure despite the uneven ground. Oliver followed as quickly and quietly as possible, guiding his wheelchair along a compact path they had smoothed out for easier movement. All the while, their eyes flicked between the path and the dark stretches of land beyond it. The barn loomed ahead, its outline barely discernible against the moonlit sky. Behind the barn lay the wide pasture where Champion occasionally roamed during the day. Tonight, the horse was safely locked in his stall, but that did little to quell the knot of anxiety tightening in Oliver's gut. As they rounded the corner of the barn, they crouched, or in Oliver's case, lowered his profile, to avoid being silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Wes scanned the horizon with those night vision binoculars, pausing abruptly. "Movement about 50 yards to our left," he whispered. "There's definitely two of them now. They're creeping along the fence line, staying low." Oliver's heart hammered. He had faced worse dangers before, but the thought that these trespassers might be after Champion triggered a fiercely protective instinct. "We can't let them damage the fence or spook the horse," he whispered back, mind racing through possibilities. Should they confront the intruders directly, or try to scare them off, or even call the local sheriff immediately? Wes, still peering through the binoculars, muttered, "They're splitting up. One's heading for the front gate. The other is circling toward the pasture fence." Taking a steadying breath, Oliver keyed the walkie-talkie that connected them to Carl, who had stationed himself near the main house to watch the camera feeds in real time. "Carl, can you see the guy near the front gate?" Carl's voice trembled through the speaker. "Yes, he's messing with something. Maybe the lock on the gate. I can't get a clear look. There's also movement near the pasture camera, but I can't make out what they're doing." Before Oliver could respond, a metallic clank echoed from the direction of the gate, followed by a muffled curse that carried on the wind. Wes stiffened. "They're trying to cut through the chain or the lock. We need to move now." Oliver nodded, adrenaline surging. "Let's split up. I'll head to the gate west with the Carl. You handle whoever is at the pasture." "Understood," Wes agreed without hesitation, slipping away with a fluidity that reminded Oliver of old Special Forces maneuvers. Alone now, Oliver pressed forward, gripping the wheels of his chair firmly. He made quick progress along the smooth path they had prepared weeks ago for convenience, never anticipating it might be used in a nighttime security sweep. Reaching the corner of the main house, Oliver spotted Carl hunched behind a low fence, clutching a flashlight and looking decidedly out of his depth. A sense of grim determination washed over Oliver. If these people wanted to harass him, if they wanted to intimidate him into giving up Champion, they had picked the wrong soldier to corner. Carl's voice shook as Oliver reached him. "They're still there," he whispered, jerking his head toward the driveway gate. "I heard them snapping something. Maybe the chain." Oliver nodded, then motioned for Carl to kill the flashlight. The last thing they needed was to give away their position. Even from their vantage point, Oliver could see two beams of light flickering near the gate, a sign that at least one intruder was using a flashlight to inspect their handiwork. The clang of metal on metal sounded again, echoing in the still night air. With his heart pounding in his ears, Oliver raised his handgun, more for deterrence than anything else. He prayed he wouldn't have to use it, but he was fully prepared if the trespasser turned aggressive. "Stay low," he instructed Carl, keeping his voice steady. "I'm going to call out to them. If they run, let them go. If they come at us, we'll defend ourselves." Summoning the authoritative tone he had once used to command troops, Oliver shouted, "Stop right there! You're trespassing on private property!" His voice rang loud and clear, cutting through the hush of the night. For a heartbeat, all went still. Then came a flurry of movement, the intruder's flashlight beam spinning wildly as if searching for the source of the voice. Oliver heard a string of panicked profanity, followed by the rapid crunch of gravel under boots. The gate rattled as the figure climbed over it, landing with a muted thud on the other side. Oliver exhaled a shaky breath. He couldn't see well in the darkness, but he sensed the person fleeing down the road toward the black SUV that neighbors had reported earlier. "They're running," he said, turning to Carl, who still gripped the flashlight. "Let's see if Wes needs backup." They moved as quickly as they could, following the path that skirted around the barn. Suddenly, a loud whinny ripped through the silence, a sound laced with alarm. Oliver's heart lurched. Champion. Was the second intruder attempting to break into the horse's stall? Or cut the fence to lead Champion away? Go, Oliver commanded Carl, who sprinted ahead, flashlight bobbing as he raced toward the stable. Oliver, moving as fast as his chair would allow, found himself muttering silent prayers under his breath. He refused to let anyone lay a hand on Champion. Around the side of the barn, the motion sensor lights flared, revealing a scene that made Oliver's blood boil. A tall, lean figure stood near the fence, bolt cutters in hand. Wes was already there, weapon drawn, his posture rigid and ready. Champion was in his stall, ears pinned back, clearly agitated. The intruder was cornered in a wedge of bright light, pivoting as if searching for an escape route. As Oliver arrived, the intruder made a desperate lunge for the darkness beyond the lights. But Wes lunged faster. A single, well-placed tackle sent the bolt cutters clattering to the ground. The intruder yelped and hit the dirt, disarmed by the force of Wes's takedown. Oliver let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, an overwhelming wave of relief washing over him. For the moment, at least, Champion was safe. While Wes pinned the intruder's arms behind his back, Oliver wheeled closer, adrenaline still flooding his veins. He flicked on the intruder's dropped flashlight, directing the beam at the face half buried in the dust. The man squinted and turned away, as if the glare were more terrifying than the possibility of arrest. "Who are you?" Oliver demanded, the mix of anger and fear making his voice uncharacteristically harsh. "Why are you on my property?" The intruder mumbled incoherently, then spat out a mouthful of dirt. He looked younger than Oliver had expected, possibly in his mid-20s. Pale and thin, he wore plain black clothing that bore no military insignia. As Oliver focused the light more closely, he could see the man trembling. "Check for ID," Wes said, maintaining a firm grip. Carl approached cautiously, rummaging through the intruder's pockets until he fished out a slim wallet and a phone. Opening the wallet revealed a driver's license. Evan Porter was the name, though it told them nothing about why he was trespassing. Oliver eyed the phone in Carl's hand. "Unlock it," he ordered. When Evan hesitated, Wes increased the pressure on his arms. "Unless you want us to hand this over to the sheriff and let them sort it out." Under duress, Evan keyed in his passcode. Carl scrolled through the recent messages, eyes widening as he read. "Looks like instructions for scaring the horse, messing with the fence line. Someone named CH is sending them. No full name, just initials." Oliver felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't need a detective to guess who CH might be. Colonel Harrington, the logistics officer who had initially refused to release Champion, sprang immediately to mind. The man was notorious for being single-minded when it came to military assets, and Oliver had clashed with him before. "This is bigger than just a random thief," Wes said, voice grim. "He's under orders from someone. This text here mentions forcing you to relinquish the horse." Evan, panting in the dirt, finally found his voice. I didn't know the whole story," he stammered, desperation lacing his words. "They just told me to come here, damage the fence, maybe get the horse running loose. Then I was supposed to send a signal, and they'd handle the rest." A cold fury washed over Oliver. This confirmed his worst suspicions. The verdict in his favor was being challenged by shadowy, extrajudicial tactics. He exchanged a look with Wes, who gave a curt nod. They had enough evidence, threatening messages the intruder caught red-handed, to involve the authorities in a serious way now. Behind them, Champion stomped restlessly in his stall, snorting as if to voice his own outrage. Oliver reached a calming hand through the stall bars, brushing the horse's muzzle to reassure him. A million thoughts whirled through his mind, but one stood out with sharp clarity. Whoever was pulling the strings wouldn't stop here, not when they believed Champion still belonged to them. Oliver turned to Carl and said, "Call the sheriff. This ends tonight." But even as he spoke those words, he couldn't help but sense that this was merely a battle won in a larger war, one that might soon escalate beyond the borders of Stillwater Ranch. When the dust finally settled that night, the local sheriff, Dwayne Harlow, arrived in response to Carl's urgent call. Red and blue lights sliced across the ranch property, illuminating faces etched with adrenaline and anger. The intruder, Evan Porter, was handcuffed and seated on a bale of hay outside the barn, fidgeting anxiously as he watched Sheriff Harlow converse with Oliver Hayes, Wes Carter, and Carl. A few ranch hands hovered nearby, fueled by a mix of curiosity and righteous outrage at the violation of Stillwater Ranch's peace. Sheriff Harlow, a tall man with a weathered countenance, earned from decades of policing in rural counties, gave Wes a respectful nod as he finished hearing their account. "So you tackled this young man while he was attempting to cut through the fence?" he asked, sounding both skeptical and concerned. Wes, arms crossed, nodded. "He and an accomplice were trying to breach the property. The other one escaped, but we managed to detain this guy." Oliver still gripped the handles of his wheelchair, knuckles white from how tightly he held them. The fear and anger of the night's events rippled through him, and he took a moment to calm his breathing before addressing the sheriff. He admitted he was acting under orders from somebody called CH. "We believe it's Colonel Daniel Harrington, a logistics officer who has a history with Champion, my horse, and me." Evan, overhearing the exchange, shook his head vigorously, though it was unclear if he was denying involvement or simply reacting in panic. Regardless, the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. The bolt cutters, the messages on his phone, and his presence on private property after dark. Between those incriminating details and his own admission that someone hired him, there was little room for ambiguity. Sheriff Harlow sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked over at Evan. "Son, is there anything you want to say to clarify your situation?" Eyes wild, Evan hesitated. Finally, words spilled from him in a rushed confession. "I didn't know it'd go this far. They promised me easy money if I could help them reclaim government property. I'm strapped for cash, and He broke off, shoulders sagging in defeat. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." The sheriff exchanged a quick glance with Oliver, his brows knitting in disapproval. "If what he says is true, we've got a much bigger issue than a simple trespassing case. This Harrington fella, if he's really behind it, could be orchestrating a larger campaign to undermine the court's ruling." He then turned to Evan, eyes flinty. "You'll be coming down to the station. We'll have more questions for you. Obstruction, trespassing, attempted property damage, it's all on the table." Evan nodded miserably, clearly resigned to his fate. As the sheriff placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, guiding him toward the flashing squad car, Oliver felt a swirl of relief, anger, and an undercurrent of dread. This confrontation was over, but it felt like a prelude to something more dangerous brewing beyond Stillwater Ranch's borders. By the time the sheriff's cruiser and the other patrol cars pulled away, the ranch stood eerily silent under a sky dotted with anxious stars. In the aftermath, Oliver wheeled himself toward Champion's stall, needing the reassurance of the horse's steady presence. Moonlight filtered through the rafters, illuminating Champion's coat in a gentle silver glow. Even though it was well past midnight, the horse was still awake, pacing near the gate as though expecting another threat. Oliver exhaled a shaky breath, placing a calming hand on Champion's neck. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, the words as much for himself as for the horse. In response, Champion let out a soft nicker, pressing his muzzle into Oliver's shoulder. The simple contact steadied him in a way nothing else could. Wes stepped into the stable a moment later, hooking his thumbs into the loops of his belt. "Sheriff Harlow said he's going to look into the matter first thing in the morning, but you and I both know official investigations can take time," he said quietly. His gaze fell on Champion, then back to Oliver. "You sure you're ready for what might come next?" Oliver nodded, though he felt his stomach knot at the thought. "I don't have a choice. Champion and I have been through worse." His mind drifted back to the deserts of Afghanistan, the gunfire, the explosions, and the day Champion dragged him to safety. If they had survived that hell, they could endure this. Taking a step back, Wes let his eyes travel around the interior of the stable, scanning for weaknesses. "I suggest we tighten security even more. Whoever paid Evan might send others to do what he failed to accomplish. We can't rule out sabotage or an outright attempt at theft." Outside, the wind gusted, clattering the stable doors. For a split second, Oliver imagined uniformed officials marching onto the ranch with military orders to seize Champion. He had won in court, but the note in his mailbox and the trespassers at the fence were painful evidence that some people cared more about an old ledger or a matter of principle than the humanity and horse at the center of this conflict. Carl appeared in the stable doorway, face lined with exhaustion. Sheriff said there'd be extra patrols driving by in the next few days, but you know how short-staffed they are. Can't count on them to guard the place around the clock. Then we do it ourselves, Wes answered firmly, locking eyes with Oliver. We set up a watchy schedule, rotate shifts. If Harrington or anyone else tries to push their luck, they'll find out they're not dealing with civilians who scare easy. Oliver appreciated Wes's resolve, but he also knew that living in a constant state of vigilance took a mental toll. Nonetheless, he stroked Champion's mane and whispered, "We'll protect you." Inside, a spark of defiance flared. He had fought too hard to let bureaucratic bullies tear away the one living connection that kept him grounded. If it came down to another battle, so be it. Morning brought a semblance of normalcy, blue skies, dew-kissed grass, and the distant crow of a rooster on a neighboring farm. But the uneasy undercurrent remained. Noah Caldwell, who had stepped away on personal business the previous evening, returned to find the ranch buzzing with tension. When he heard about the late-night intruders and Evan Porter's arrest, Noah's normally stoic expression darkened. "I figured they might do something underhanded," he muttered, leaning against the barn wall with arms folded across his broad chest. "But breaking in at night? That's brazen." Oliver explained the events in succinct detail. How they'd caught Evan near the barn with bolt cutters, how the second intruder fled, and how the sheriff had taken Evan into custody. Noah listened in silence, then let out a deep sigh. "I can contact a few more folks from our old unit," he offered. "People who know what it means to hold the line. If Harrington ramps up pressure, you'll want all the help you can get." Wes, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. "Won't hurt to have more eyes around here. This place is big, and we can't monitor every inch with just a handful of us." The conversation was interrupted by the roar of an engine. A police SUV rumbled up the driveway and out stepped Sheriff Harlow, looking bleary-eyed but resolute. He walked up to the small group, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Morning, just came from interviewing the suspect, Evan Porter. Kid singing like a canary," he said without preamble. "Claims the man pulling the strings is some Colonel Harrington, who's been funneling money through a shell account to keep his hands clean." A wave of grim satisfaction passed through Oliver. At least they now had an official confirmation that Harrington was behind this. "Does that mean you can charge him?" he asked. Sheriff Harlow grimaced. "Charging a high-ranking officer without ironclad evidence is tricky. We need a direct link, a communication trail that points to him specifically. Right now, we only have a suspect's claim and some text messages signed CH. That's not bulletproof." Oliver's hope deflated. "He's using middlemen," he muttered. "Even if you try to subpoena his records, he'll bury them under red tape. By the time any of it surfaces, he might strike again," finished Noah, rubbing a calloused hand over his beard. Harlow nodded. "Precisely. I've got a detective looking into it, but I can't promise immediate results. If Harrington's as well connected as he seems, he'll have ways to drag this out. My advice is to stay vigilant. I've also spoken to Ms. Rollins, your attorney. She's working on legal avenues, possibly a protective order or some federal injunction." Oliver rolled back slightly, feeling the burden of this never-ending struggle. His eyes drifted to Champion, visible through the open barn door, munching hay as if all was right in the world. The horse's innocence in this whole affair fueled Oliver's determination. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We'll stay on guard." The officer tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "Keep me posted on anything suspicious. And remember, you're not alone in this." Yet as Noah and Wes led the sheriff back toward the driveway, Oliver couldn't shake the sense that they were, in fact, very much on their own. Military clout was formidable, and Harrington was clearly a man who didn't like losing. Stillwater Ranch became a fortress overnight. By mid-afternoon, more friends from Oliver's former unit had arrived, each bearing the haunted look of a soldier who'd seen too much but was still ready to stand with the brother in arms. Corporal Sheila Greer, whose service dog had once saved her from a roadside bomb, was among them. She approached Oliver with a firm handshake, then bent down to greet Champion with an air of reverence that only a fellow handler could understand. "I heard about Harrington's obsession with government property," Sheila said, grimacing as she patted Champion's flank. "That man once tried to seize my service dog for reassignments, He's relentless about following regulations when it suits him. She paused, offering Champion a treat. Don't worry, we're not letting that happen again. Others spread out across the ranch, forming impromptu patrols and discussing tactics for deterring further intrusions. It felt surreal, like they'd been plucked from their civilian lives and thrust back into a mission scenario. Yet the camaraderie that bound them in war reemerged quickly. Walkie-talkies, flashlights, and a sense of readiness replaced the usual tools of horse grooming and ranch maintenance. While the veterans worked on security logistics, Ms. Rollins arrived with a stack of documents and a determined set to her jaw. Oliver met her on the porch, where she spread out the papers on a makeshift table. "I've filed an emergency injunction," she announced, tapping a legal document filled with jargon. "If Harrington or anyone acting on his behalf tries to seize Champion, they'll be in contempt of court. It's not foolproof, but it's another legal barrier." Oliver exhaled with relief, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease entirely. "Thank you. That might buy us time, but I have a feeling Harrington won't back off just because of more paperwork." Ms. Rollins nodded. "Agreed. He's already chosen to circumvent the law with intimidation. But every move he makes gives us more evidence. Keep collecting it. If we can establish a direct link between him and these hired goons, we can bring heavier charges." A sudden commotion drew their attention to the yard, where two of Oliver's friends had intercepted a delivery driver who appeared lost. They were questioning him with the intensity of a checkpoint interrogation until it became clear he was simply trying to drop off a package. Ms. Rollins snorted softly. "You have quite the protective detail," she commented. Oliver managed a tight smile. Better safe than sorry. Before she departed, Ms. Rollins placed a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Hang in there. This won't be easy, but you've got the law on your side, and a lot of people who believe in you." Oliver watched her drive away, feeling both gratitude and the heaviness of responsibility. The ranch, once a tranquil haven for his healing and therapy with Champion, was now bristling with a battle-ready energy. A quiet part of him mourned the loss of that peace, longing for a day when he and Champion could return to simply living, rather than constantly defending their right to do so. Despite the heightened security, life on the ranch had to carry on. Champion still needed grooming, feeding, and exercise. The other animals, though fewer in number, also required care. Crops needed tending, fences needed mending, and routine chores piled up fast. Oliver refused to let the threat of Harrington's interference rob him of the structure he found comforting. So each day, he allocated a few hours to chores, using the tasks as a kind of therapy that connected him to life's simple rhythms. Noah, Wes, and Sheila took turns patrolling the perimeter, occasionally joined by other veterans who dropped by as schedules allowed. The men and women swapped war stories and jokes, an odd juxtaposition of gallows humor set against the bright backdrop of farmland. Though they tried to keep the mood light, the tension was never far from the surface. A snapped twig or an unexpected engine sound was enough to set everyone on edge. Meanwhile, Ms. Rollins coordinated with Sheriff Harlow, who was painstakingly building a case based on Evan Porter's testimony. The young intruder had revealed more about Harrington's network, a series of shell companies and untraceable payment methods. Harrington's plan, it seemed, involved demonstrating that Oliver was unfit to care for Champion, either by orchestrating an accident or provoking a situation that would make it appear so. Once labeled incompetent or negligent, Oliver's legal claim to Champion could be revoked, leaving Harrington free to repossess the horse. Yet days passed without a new incident, lulling the ranch into a cautious optimism. Oliver found himself smiling more when working with Champion, who seemed to pick up on the lighter atmosphere. The horse would trot alongside Oliver's wheelchair on the training track they'd laid down, ears pricked forward in curiosity. Each evening, Oliver would brush Champion's coat until it gleamed like burnished copper, recalling those uncertain early days when the horse had been his sole reason to keep fighting. One afternoon, as Oliver practiced guiding Champion around barrel obstacles, Sheila approached, a phone in hand. "Got a tip from a friend stationed at Fort Braxton," she said quietly, her eyes flicking from Oliver to Champion. "Word is Harrington's under some internal investigation for misuse of resources." Oliver's brow lifted. "Really? That's promising. Maybe the brass won't let him slide on everything." "Could be, but be careful," Sheila warned. "If he feels cornered, he might pull out all the stops." Despite the caution, news of any official pressure on Harrington sparked hope. Perhaps the colonel's superiors recognized that he'd gone too far. Oliver pictured the day he could finally breathe easy, no longer scanning the horizon for threats. For the first time since the court's ruling, he allowed himself to imagine a future where Champion's ownership was indisputable, and the ranch returned to its rightful role as a place of healing rather than a fortress. Unknown to Oliver, however, the real storm was still on the horizon, gathering strength in the corridors of military power where Colonel Harrington wielded more influence than they realized. Around the ranch's makeshift command center, really just a corner of the living room with monitors for the security cameras, Noah and Wes examined the feed from the late-night hours of the previous evening. Sparse moments of wildlife crossing the property flickered on screen. A raccoon scuttling near the barn, a stray cat slinking along a fence, but nothing sinister. One by one, other veterans checked in, reporting no suspicious activity. Sheila said she's heading back to Fort Braxton for a couple of days to see if she can learn more about Harrington's situation, Noah remarked, tapping a pen against the table. I might do the same, see if any old buddies in the bureaucracy can dig up something. Wes nodded thoughtfully. We need every angle covered. The sooner we can prove Harrington's behind this, the sooner we can shut him down for good. Oliver entered, carefully maneuvering his wheelchair around the coffee table. I appreciate everything you're doing, he said quietly, rolling up to the monitor desk. The readings all showed typical pastoral scenes, swaying trees, faint shapes in the barn. I just wish we knew what his next move would be. Before anyone could respond, Carl burst in from the porch, nearly tripping over the welcome mat. His face was pale and he held out a small stack of letters with trembling fingers. Oliver, these just arrived in the mail. Stacked on top was an envelope printed with a military seal, addressed to Mr. Oliver Hayes. The return label was from Fort Tennyson, a name that made Oliver's heart skip. Another smaller envelope bore no return address, but had the same ominous feeling as the "this isn't over" note he'd received before. Oliver opened the official envelope first, scanning the contents. His breath caught. It was a summons to appear for a special review of the court's ruling requested by the Army's Logistics Division. Terms like reassessment, government property, and statutory compliance leapt off the page. A deep unease pulled in Oliver's chest. If they were reopening the matter in a military forum, they might be able to override or undermine the civilian court's decision, especially if Harrington had allies pushing from within. Noah and Wes crowded around, reading over Oliver's shoulder. This looks like they're trying to do an end run around civilian jurisdiction, Noah observed grimly. Wes pointed to a section near the bottom. They're calling you to a hearing at Fort Tennyson next week. It's not optional. Setting that aside, Oliver tore open the smaller envelope. The note inside was typed in block letters. That horse never belonged to you. Comply or face consequences. His stomach churned. It was confirmation that Harrington or someone aligned with him was stepping up pressure from multiple angles. This is insane, Oliver said, voice tight with frustration. One court already ruled in my favor. Wes's jaw clenched. They're trying to bury you under bureaucracy and intimidation. We'll go with you to that hearing. No way you're facing them alone. An echo of determination flared in Oliver's eyes, reflecting the same grit that had carried him through war zones. We're not surrendering, champion, he said with quiet finality. Not now, not ever. The following morning, Miss Rollins drove to the ranch before sunrise, pressing the summons in her hand like a piece of evidence at a crime scene. She read it over twice, lips thinning with each pass. They're claiming that new information necessitates a review by a military tribunal, she explained, shaking her head in disbelief. But you're a civilian now, Oliver. Their reach over you is limited, except for the matter of champion. Oliver frowned. Can they legally force me to show up? They can threaten further legal action if you don't comply. And while the Army can't drag you away in handcuffs for ignoring a summons, it could look bad in any subsequent proceedings, like you're hiding something. Ms. Rollins sighed, resting the document on the table. From a strategic standpoint, I say we go. We'll present our side, demonstrate cooperation, but I'll be right there with you, fighting any attempt to override the civilian court's decision. Noah, standing nearby, crossed his arms. And some of us will be there to make sure it stays a fair hearing, he added, glancing at Wes for confirmation. Wes nodded, a silent promise that Oliver wouldn't be alone. Carl, listening from the corner of the room, cleared his throat. What about the ranch? Should we keep a guard detail here while you're gone? If Harrington's sneaky enough, he might try something when you're off property. Oliver's eyes darted to the window, where Champion grazed peacefully under the morning light. Despite the horse's calm demeanor, Oliver knew the tranquility could evaporate in an instant. Yes, he said firmly, we need eyes on Champion at all times. Carl, coordinate with whoever's able to stay. We can't risk leaving the ranch unprotected. A strategy began to form. Ms. Rollins would accompany Oliver to Fort Tennyson with a small group of his most trusted allies, Noah, Wes, and possibly Sheila, if she could arrange leave. Meanwhile, a rotating team of veterans and local friends would keep watch over Stillwater Ranch. Though it felt excessive, Oliver reminded himself that Harrington had already demonstrated willingness to operate in legal gray areas. Desperate men often resorted to desperate measures. Ms. Rollins pointed to a date on the document. The hearing is in 5 days. I'll gather all the relevant paperwork, court transcripts, medical records, training logs, and the judge's ruling. If they're trying to find a loophole, we'll show them the facts. Swallowing a lump in his throat, Oliver nodded. A sense of foreboding settled over him, heavier than any he'd felt since returning from deployment. He had envisioned a quiet life of rehab and healing after the war, but destiny seemed intent on granting him neither quiet nor rest. Even so, he looked at the photograph of himself and Champion, tacked on the fridge door, and felt a surge of steadfast resolve. Then we'll go, Oliver said, voice low but unyielding, and we'll fight them on their own turf if we have to. The 5 days leading up to the hearing at Fort Tennyson passed in a flurry of preparation. Ms. Rollins meticulously assembled every piece of evidence that underscored Oliver's rightful ownership of Champion, veterinary records, affidavits from fellow soldiers who had witnessed Champion's life-saving actions, and the official ruling from the civilian court that had sided decisively with Oliver. By the time she was done, 2 thick binders brimming with documents sat on the ranch's old wooden dining table. While Ms. Rollins handled the legal side, Oliver focused on his mental readiness. Each morning, he wheeled himself out to the paddock where Champion was allowed to roam. He'd spend a few quiet moments with the horse, brushing out tangles in the mane or guiding him through gentle exercises. Though the overshadowing tension never fully dissipated, those moments offered a sliver of calm. Sometimes he caught glimpses of motion on the far fence line, likely a watchful friend or a camera's lens, ensuring no intruder slipped onto the property. But he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Champion's steady breathing. Every so often, one of his military buddies arrived with updates. Sheila Greer sent word that some superiors at Fort Braxton were uneasy about Harrington's escalating involvement in repossessing assets that had been decommissioned. Noah was reaching out to certain contacts to see if an official inquiry had begun. The consensus was that Harrington was either desperate to prove a point or being pressured by someone higher up. Either scenario spelled trouble for Oliver. As the deadline approached, Ms. Rollins orchestrated the travel logistics. 2 vehicles would depart for Fort Tennyson, one for Oliver, Ms. Rollins, Noah, and Wes, and another for a few additional supporters who refused to let Oliver go it alone. Though he appreciated the solidarity, Oliver felt a pang of guilt dragging his friends into this ever-deepening quagmire. Yet each of them insisted they had Oliver's back, reminders of the unbreakable bonds forged on battlefields far from home. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Oliver found himself unable to sleep. He quietly wheeled outside, pausing by the fence to watch a sky pinpricked with stars. Champion had settled down in his stall, but the horse occasionally shifted, letting out soft huffs that drifted on the cool breeze. In the distance, a pair of security lights glowed, marking the presence of watchful friends. Turning his gaze skyward, Oliver let old memories wash over him. Images of nights in foreign deserts, where the stars were a constant but life was anything but stable. He had survived ambushes, IED blasts, and the relentless grind of war, only to come home and face another kind of battle for the simple right to keep the one companion who had risked his own life to save Oliver's. Steeling himself, he breathed out a silent vow. You survived Afghanistan. You can handle a colonel's hearing. Champion was more than an animal. He was Oliver's anchor, and some colonel's vendetta would not sever that bond without a fight. Dawn broke on the day of the hearing, painting Stillwater Ranch in a muted palette of pink and orange. Oliver, Ms. Rollins, Noah, and Wes piled into a sturdy SUV, while a second car carrying two more of Oliver's trusted friends followed close behind. In the rearview mirror, Oliver watched the ranch shrink from view. He tried to ignore the sick feeling in his stomach, reminding himself that a handful of friends remained behind to guard Champion. The drive to Fort Tennyson took most of the morning. The base was sprawling, surrounded by high fencing, and dotted with imposing buildings, a stark contrast to the open pastures Oliver called home. Ms. Rollins handled the check-in process at the gate, brandishing legal documents to justify their presence. Military police took note of their rights, passing them through after a tense few minutes. Following the signs to the administrative offices, they finally arrived at a nondescript building that could have easily been a corporate complex if not for the rows of uniformed personnel. Inside, a receptionist directed them to a conference room on the second floor, where a small group of officers awaited. It was an austere space, beige walls, long rectangular table, and fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly. Colonel Daniel Harrington was seated at the far end of the table, flanked by two other officers Oliver didn't recognize. The colonel wore a crisp uniform adorned with medals, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable behind steely eyes. Seeing him in the flesh made Oliver's pulse quicken. They hadn't crossed paths directly since Oliver's discharge, but he remembered all too well the scathing memos Harrington had written, labeling Champion as non-recoverable equipment. "Mr. Hayes," Harrington said with an impeccably formal tone as Oliver approached, "I'm pleased you've decided to cooperate with this review." Ms. Rollins wasted no time. "He's here under protest," she stated firmly, placing the thick binders on the table. "We maintain that the civilian court ruling stands. If you intend to contest it, you'll need extraordinary evidence to justify revisiting a matter already settled by a judge." Harrington clasped his hands together, ignoring her remark. "We appreciate your diligence, Ms. Rollins," he replied, "but new circumstances have arisen. We have reason to believe that Champion's training was never fully decommissioned, and thus the animal remains an asset of the U.S. military." Oliver's jaw tightened. "That's a lie. He was retired after my last deployment." Across the table, one of the other officers, Major Lindstrom, judging by her nameplate, cleared her throat. "Let's keep the discussion calm. Mr. Hayes, you'll have a chance to present your evidence. The Army simply wants to ensure no regulation was violated when the horse was released to you." Wes stood behind Oliver, arms folded, projecting a silent warning that no intimidation would be tolerated. Meanwhile, Noah took a seat next to Ms. Rollins, ready to offer support or verification of any battlefield events. Sliding the first binder forward, Ms. Rollins said coolly, "We have the relevant documentation right here. If you truly wish to review the facts, let's begin." The colonel's thin smile hinted at deeper intentions. With a gesture toward the stack of papers, he leaned back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. Despite his composed demeanor, Oliver sensed the tension coiling in the room like a poised snake. Over the next hour, the conference room transformed into a battleground of paperwork and testimony. Ms. Rollins presented proof of Champion's official retirement date, complete with signatures from veterinary officials and commanding officers. Noah testified, recalling how Champion had been essential in scanning for threats during their missions, then was deemed unfit for further service due to the physical and psychological toll of combat. Harrington, however, wasn't easily swayed. "Records can be inaccurate," he said smoothly, as if discussing logistics for office supplies rather than a living creature. "Sometimes a soldier or an officer signs off on retirement papers prematurely. We are investigating a potential oversight." The major and captain flanking him nodded in mild agreement, flipping through Oliver's documents with polite but guarded expressions. Each time Ms. Rollins cited a regulation to confirm Champion's civilian status, Harrington countered with an obscure or contradictory policy. The bureaucracy of military documentation was labyrinthine, and Harrington appeared well-versed in its twisting corridors. At one point, Oliver's temper flared. "You're the one ignoring the rule of law here, Colonel. A civilian judge granted me permanent custody. Champion saved my life multiple times, and I've testified to that fact under oath." Coolly, Harrington folded his hands. "Yes, you have. and no one denies your service or your bond with the animal. Yet the U.S. government also has protocols for disposing of certain assets. If Champion was never formally decommissioned, as we suspect, then the judge's ruling might be based on incomplete information. Noah began to speak, but Ms. Rollins shot him a warning glance. We have thorough records from the day Champion was officially removed from active service, she reiterated, tapping a finger on a highlighted form. All your talk of a possible oversight is speculation at best. If the Army had any legitimate claim, they should have presented it at the original trial. Major Lindstrom leaned forward. We're not here to undermine a court, Ms. Rollins, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. We're here to verify the horse's status. If we find conclusive evidence that the horse was indeed properly decommissioned, we'll drop the matter. Oliver exchanged glances with Miss Rollins and Noah. It was obvious that Harrington's subordinates were towing the official line, leaving the door open for the colonel to manipulate the narrative. The tension in the room was palpable, an unspoken standoff of will and strategy. Finally, Harrington stacked the documents in a neat pile, raising his gaze to meet Oliver's eyes. We'll conduct a more thorough internal review, he announced, his voice betraying neither defeat nor concession. For now, Mr. Hayes, you're free to leave, but do not assume this matter is resolved. We'll be in contact. A hush fell. Ms. Rollins gathered her folders, her body language broadcasting both relief and indignation. Noah and Wes stood, their expressions grim. As they filed out of the room, Oliver cast one last look at Harrington, who remained seated, lips pressed into a rigid line. A silent threat passed between them. Even if Harrington lost this round, Oliver doubted the colonel would simply fade away. The sky was overcast by the time Oliver and his small entourage emerged from the administrative building. A damp chill clung to the air, matching the mood of the group. No one spoke until they reached the SUV. Then Ms. Rollins released a long breath, shaking her head. What a charade, she muttered, placing her binders on the back seat. They're feigning compliance with the law while buying time for Harrington to pull another trick. Wes, scanning the parking lot as if still in enemy territory, grunted. He's definitely not finished. I could see it in his eyes. That man's determined to prove he's right, no matter what. Noah nodded, leaning against the side of the SUV. At least we showed up, presented our case. If this ever escalates to a federal lawsuit, we can point out that we cooperated in good faith. Oliver listened in silence, the events replaying in his mind. He felt an odd mixture of anger, relief, and lingering apprehension. So what's next? He finally asked, glancing at Ms. Rollins. She closed her eyes momentarily, collecting her thoughts. Now we wait. They'll either find no fault and drop the case, which seems unlikely, or they'll discover some detail Harrington can twist. Meanwhile, we should be ready to file immediate motions if they try to overstep. With that, they loaded into their vehicles. The ride off the base felt uncomfortably similar to leaving a battlefield, uncertain about whether an unseen enemy might follow. As they pulled onto the main highway, Oliver's phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed Carl's name on the caller ID. Hey, Carl, Oliver said, pressing the phone to his ear. What's up? Carl's voice crackled with excitement. One of our watchers spotted an unfamiliar SUV parked near the west fence an hour ago. They took off when approached, but we got a partial license plate, already gave it to the sheriff. Oliver's jaw tightened. Another intrusion an hour after they met face-to-face with Harrington. Coincidence? Highly unlikely. Good work, Carl. Stay vigilant. We're on our way back. He ended the call, relaying the news to the others. Ms. Rollins shook her head in frustration, while Noah and Wes exchanged dark looks. They're obviously trying to spook us, Wes said. Or maybe staging more false evidence. If they can make it look like Champion's unsafe in your care, that might bolster Harrington's claim. Oliver clenched his fist around the steering wheel's arm, a simmering anger rising in his chest. If Harrington thought scattering a few shadows on the property would deter him, he was sorely mistaken. Oliver's resolve hardened with each mile closer to Stillwater Ranch. The place he'd once viewed purely as a sanctuary now felt more like a fortress that needed active defense. He gazed out the window, spotting a hawk circling in the cloudy sky. In that hawk, he saw a symbol of freedom, something he refused to let Harrington steal from Champion or himself. The colonel might have more resources and bureaucratic cunning, But Oliver had unwavering loyalty, an ironclad support network, and a deep bond with the horse that had literally carried him through life's darkest valleys. When they finally reached Stillwater Ranch late that afternoon, the sun broke free from the clouds, casting sharp rays across the fields. A wave of gratitude washed over Oliver at the sight of Champion grazing peacefully near the barn. The horse raised his head, ears pricking as if to greet their return. For Oliver, that simple image reaffirmed why every legal maneuver, every risk, was worth it. Ms. Rollins headed straight into the house, phone already glued to her ear as she coordinated with the sheriff about the suspicious SUV's partial license plate. Noah and Wes decided to patrol the perimeter, ensuring nothing had been tampered with during their absence. Oliver, however, rolled over to Champion's paddock, pressing a hand to the fence as the horse ambled closer. "How's my boy?" he murmured, gently scratching the spot behind Champion's ear that always made him sigh contentedly. The tension in Oliver's body began to unwind, replaced by the serenity only Champion could provide. "I'm sorry about all this. We'll get through it," he added, as if the horse could understand every word. His phone rang again. Expecting more updates, Oliver answered without checking the ID. To his surprise, the voice on the line was Sheila Greer. "Oliver, I just got back from Fort Braxton," she said, breathless. "Word on the grapevine is that Harrington's chain of command is reviewing his conduct. A high-level official got wind of how he's allocating resources for these so-called repossessions." Oliver felt a spark of hope. "Does that mean they'll shut him down?" She hesitated. "Not necessarily, they might just keep it internal. But at least it means not everyone in the Army is turning a blind eye. If we can provide solid proof he's been abusing his authority, like paying intruders to harass you, this could turn on him." Oliver's gaze drifted to the horizon where the sky was beginning to shift into the soft hues of evening. Evan Porter's testimony might help. The sheriff's building a case, and Ms. Rollins is collecting everything. Sheila agreed. "Keep at it. The more you can show a clear link between Harrington and these incidents, the better. And Oliver?" Her voice dipped lower. "Be careful. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. If Harrington feels threatened, he might escalate." A chill passed through Oliver despite the warmth of the setting sun. "I understand. Thanks, Sheila." He hung up and gazed at Champion's calm expression. In the distance, he spotted Noah and Wes walking along the fence line, their silhouettes stark against the golden light. In that tableau of ranch life, friends guarding the property, a steadfast horse anchored by a simple wooden fence, Oliver found a reflection of his own determination. They were not powerless. They had truth, law, and loyalty on their side. A battle might lie ahead, but Oliver was through running. With Champion's muzzle resting gently against his hand, he whispered one final vow into the quiet evening air. "We're going to win this, together." From my own perspective, this entire journey proves that loyalty, courage, and unity can triumph even against powerful adversaries. Oliver Hayes stood firm in his love for Champion, refusing to allow outdated regulations or underhanded tactics to sever the bond that had healed him in his darkest hours. The people who rallied to defend them showed that genuine support isn't just about changing laws. It's about standing together when it matters most. Now that the dust has settled, there's a renewed sense of hope at Stillwater Ranch. This story stands as a testament to what can happen when individuals fight not just for themselves, but for the well-being of those who depend on them, human or animal. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below with your opinions, and let's discuss how stories like this can inspire us all to persevere. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting tales in the future.